Okay, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I was asked to talk to you about assessing anxiety and depression in people who are experiencing breathlessness or other long-term conditions, and also something about what you might then do when it's obvious that anxiety and depression are playing a part. Clearly, I don't need to say very much about assessing because you know that already. Anyway, so just very quickly about why it's so important to assess for anxiety and depression. Really common, quite easy to miss, especially when there's lots and lots else going on, as we saw in that last example. There's lots of evidence that it has a big impact on health outcomes and actually how somebody is doing functionally. A lot of that seems to be explained by how they are emotionally, psychologically, rather than just physically. And also a big impact on quality of life. And also, of course, because it's actually not difficult to do something about it. So it's just like a real shame if it's missed and then no help is given. The very quickest screening thing is the PHQ-4, which I'm sure you know. So it's just 2 items of the PHQ-9 and 2 items of the GAD-7. I'm sure you know this as well. So the kind of recommendation is to follow up if the score is 6 or more, or 3 or more on the anxiety questions, or 3 or more on the depression questions. Obviously, the GAD-7 is particularly for generalised anxiety disorder, and it isn't necessarily going to pick up anxiety if someone's become quite avoidant. You know, so we might see someone, for example, who's quite agoraphobic, and they're not really reporting many anxiety symptoms because they've got so good at avoiding them. So just to kind of be aware, it's good for generalised anxiety, but it's not very good for other anxiety disorders. Particularly where someone's avoidant. And of course the PHQ-9, because of the somatic symptoms in there, may overestimate the level of depression because the problems with sleep may be something else. So just note of caution around those. So I was going to talk about 4 different kinds of possibilities of the way that breathlessness and anxiety and depression might interact, so things to look for. And I thought in each case I'd just say something about how to assess and ask, how to explain and formulate with the patient, and suggesting ways forward. So then what do you do? So the first one is generalised anxiety disorder. And obviously, this is what the GAD-7 is designed for, so it's very easily picked up with that questionnaire. As I'm sure you're aware, what we're kind of looking for there is somebody who's really caught up in worries about lots of different things, trying to solve problems ahead that haven't yet arisen. Very often a lot of associated muscle tension, so increased aches and pains and fatigue, and of course the muscle tension will also affect the breathlessness, being chronically tense and often headaches, and then irritability, difficulty making decisions, and then that can affect relationship with family, and so kind of feeling less supported because kind of getting snappy and irritable because of all the worry. It can be really helpful, I think, to explain that kind of spiral that someone can get into. So how the worries, this is just an example. It would go slightly different ways, wouldn't it, with different patients. But when we worry a lot, we do get tense. Tension causes aches and pains, affects sleep, affects irritability. So because of that spiral, intervening anywhere is likely to be helpful. Yeah? So a very easy thing to suggest as a way forward is actually relaxation training. And progressive muscle relaxation is in the NICE guideline for generalised anxiety disorder because there's plenty of evidence that it actually does help. It doesn't help everybody, but it's in there. It helps enough people for it to be in the NICE guideline. One possible source, it's actually £1.50, but you can download a progressive muscle relaxation tape from the Get Self-Help website. There's been at least one small RCT of people with COPD and anxiety and progressive muscle relaxation. And again, just tapes. They weren't getting any other intervention, they were just getting a tape to listen to, and anxiety did come down. So not to underestimate relaxation. One of the things we use a lot with our guided self-help for generalised anxiety is the book The Worry Cure, which you know you can prescribe on the books on prescription. And we actually get very good patient feedback with The Worry Cure. Involves quite a lot of reading though, so just to be aware of that. Note of caution. With that kind of explanation about, oh, relaxation is going to be a good idea, patients can hear, you mustn't get stressed. And quite often there are already negative beliefs about stress, negative beliefs about anxiety symptoms. And so they're more likely to hear that because it's what they think already. This stress is very, very bad for me. And then that may lead to increased avoidance, which is actually the last thing you want. So that message has to be given carefully, I think. And what you say and what's heard are not the same thing. Yeah, so it's that. Also, obviously, GAD is fueled by bad things happening, feeling unprepared for them, uncertain about when the next bad thing will happen, and feeling vulnerable. Now, breathlessness is going to give people those experiences, isn't it? Bad things happening, out of control, vulnerable, not sure when it's going to happen. So if you didn't have GAD already, actually, breathlessness is likely to give it to you. And it's actually very common in people with breathlessness problems. And so the stuff on the leaflet, the ABCs, about how you take control, how you be calm, that is so helpful in just kind of reducing this worry. So I think that's a fantastic sort of first step to be doing with people, and maybe stopping the level of worry ever getting that far. You know, if people are given clear information that helps them take control early on. So panic. Now, panic won't necessarily be picked up by the GAD-7. So it is about asking about attacks of anxiety that come on suddenly. Really helpful to talk through a specific example. And I'm sure most of you do that anyway. And if you've done the 10-minute CBT training, you'd be fantastic at doing it. So you go through an example. You help them to go through very slowly. What was the first thing you noticed? Then what did you notice? Then what happened? Or sort of starting, what was the first sign of trouble? So you can see where they're coming into that spiral. There seems to be evidence that this cognitive model of panic, that it's our appraisal, it's the interpretation of the symptoms that's so important. That cognitive model seems to apply when COPD is present just as much as in people who haven't got COPD or another breathlessness problem. It's still the appraisal that's key in a spiral. That doesn't mean that people will necessarily be able to give you those thoughts, of course. So, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, but the cognitive model of panic, so breathlessness, catastrophic thoughts, brain goes danger, fight or flight, breathing, then people are trying to breathe more because the body's preparing for this fighting or flighting that you can't actually do, so it all gets worse. So the way forward, psychoeducation is really effective in panic. There are lots of different psychoeducation materials, and I'm sure there are some that you use, but one example are the NTW booklets, and the link is there. And that's really nice because actually it's on audio as well as a booklet, so it's kind of available for more people to access. Being sure that the patient can understand the symptoms of panic that they're experiencing in terms of fight or flight. So, you know, I've kind of made the mistake where I feel I've kind of gone through this over and over, and then if I ask the patient to tell me back it, I realise they haven't got it, even though it seemed really simple and straightforward, and I thought they were following me at the time. So asking them to tell you, actually you will often see the gaps in understanding that can be really surprising. Because of course when you're anxious you don't take stuff in properly anyway, do you? It's kind of not understandable from that point of view. Understandable from that point of view. And then practicing responding calmly, again, is on the breathlessness leaflet that you've got. The next one is kind of the spiral that's already been talked about several times this afternoon, about even if the anxiety or the low mood is not that severe, it tends to lead to avoidance. Partly because of the embarrassment, of either coughing or getting out of breath, not being able to keep up with other people, or just the fear of getting breathless itself. And so people can become isolated, obviously, and unfit. So I've kind of just done two spirals. One is the deconditioning, getting less fit because you stop going out because you don't want to feel breathless. And the other one is the social isolation and sort of general loss of confidence and the impact on relationships. Obviously the way forward is to try and go very small steps, but something quite structured is really helpful. And there's been some research looking at how people cope and intervention studies putting in coping statements. And this does seem to be really effective, that people who are managing quite well are doing encouraging self-talk. And if they're not coping so well, they're probably not doing the encouraging self-talk. They're doing sort of hopeless, self-defeating self-talk. And so to identify what those thoughts are, and maybe even put them on a coping card, so they're very aware then of what these negative ones are on one side of the card, and then what they find encouraging to say to themselves on the other side of the card. That's been part of some of the interventions that have really helped. So that's quite a simple first step. And obviously with all of these first steps, you'd then be reviewing, wouldn't you? And then if you think that more input around panic or around worry or around increasing activity, then obviously a referral to us would be good. The last one, and I know some of you actually already use this 3 systems model of emotional well-being. It's the Paul Gilbert one based on evolutionary psychology and a bit of neuroscience in the kind of in the detail of it. But it's a very simple, but many patients kind of can relate to it quite well. The idea that we've got these 3 systems, brain systems, a threat system that's going to keep us safe from danger, a motivation drive system that's the one that gets us up and out of bed and off to work or cooking the dinner or going shopping or whatever, and a safety social connection system. And for emotional health and well-being, these 3 need to be in balance. And things go wrong when they get out of balance. Now, if you're getting breathlessness, your threat-danger system is constantly being activated. And then that's going to get stronger. So you need to actually do things about your motivation drive system and your relaxation and social connection safety system to keep yourself in balance. So it's kind of just for somebody with sort of low levels of anxiety, it's just a way of explaining why it's so important. There are lots of other ways of explaining it, but it's one way of explaining why staying active is important and why social connection and relaxation and feeling safe is important. That's it. Thank you very much for listening.